What happens when the entire Supreme Court agrees on something? That's exactly what just happened in a rare 9-0 unanimous decision from the Supreme Court of the United States, and the impact could be felt across the entire country. Even more surprising, the ruling is already triggering calls for expansion and broader application nationwide. One of the most striking aspects of this development is the fact that the decision was completely unanimous. All 9 justices of the Supreme Court of the United States agreed on the outcome, resulting in a rare 9-0 ruling. In today's legal and political environment, that level of agreement is unusual and immediately signals that the court viewed the legal question as especially clear. The Supreme Court often decides cases by narrow margins, such as 5-4 or 6-3, particularly when the issue involves major constitutional questions, government authority, or controversial policy disputes. Because of that, when every justice reaches the same conclusion, it sends a powerful message about the strength of the legal reasoning behind the ruling. A unanimous decision also carries symbolic weight. It shows that justices who are often perceived as belonging to different judicial philosophies, sometimes described as conservative, liberal, or moderate, were able to come together on a shared interpretation of the law. This suggests that the core issue in the case may not have been viewed by the court as a close ideological debate, but rather as a matter where the legal boundaries were clearly defined. When the court speaks with one voice like this, it often increases the authority of the decision and reduces uncertainty for lower courts that must follow the precedent. Another important effect of a 9-0 ruling is the signal it sends to judges across the country. Federal and state courts frequently look to the Supreme Court for guidance when interpreting federal law or constitutional principles. A unanimous opinion from the Supreme Court of the United States leaves very little room for conflicting interpretations. Lower courts are more likely to apply the ruling consistently because the justices themselves showed complete agreement about how the law should be understood. For legal observers, this type of decision often indicates that the court believed the lower court ruling or the challenged policy had significant legal flaws. When all 9 justices reach the same conclusion, it strongly suggests the court felt the correction was necessary to clarify the law and reinforce the proper limits of government authority. At the center of the case was a dispute over whether a government rule or regulatory action had gone beyond the authority granted under federal law. The issue brought before the Supreme Court of the United States focused on how a particular statute should be interpreted and whether the agency responsible for enforcing that law had expanded its power beyond what Congress originally intended. When cases like this reach the nation's highest court, the justices are not simply reviewing policy outcomes. Instead, they are examining whether the legal framework supporting those policies aligns with the Constitution and the laws passed by Congress. After reviewing the arguments and the lower court decisions, the justices determined that the rule in question could not stand as written. The court concluded that the interpretation being used by the government stretched the language of the statute too far, and effectively created authority that lawmakers had not clearly granted. By striking down the rule, the court clarified how the law must be applied moving forward and reinforced the principle that agencies must operate strictly within the boundaries established by legislation. This type of ruling is significant because federal agencies often rely on broad interpretations of statutes to implement regulations across complex areas such as commerce, safety, environmental protection, or administrative enforcement. When the Supreme Court of the United States steps in to narrow or correct that interpretation, it can reshape how those agencies function and how future rules are written. The decision essentially serves as a reminder that regulatory authority comes from Congress, not from the agencies themselves. Another important aspect of the ruling is that it provides clarity for courts and policymakers across the country. By explaining how the statute should be interpreted, the court sets a legal precedent that lower courts must follow when reviewing similar disputes. This helps create consistency in how the law is applied nationwide and prevents conflicting interpretations from developing in different jurisdictions. Ultimately, the ruling underscores a central constitutional principle. Federal agencies can enforce the law, but they cannot expand it beyond what lawmakers have clearly authorized. One of the most important aspects of this ruling is that its effects are not limited to a single state or a single court. Because the decision came from the Supreme Court of the United States, it immediately becomes binding precedent across the entire country. That means federal courts, state courts dealing with federal issues, and government agencies must all take this ruling into account when interpreting and applying the law. In practical terms, a decision like this can reshape how similar cases are handled nationwide. When the Supreme Court clarifies how a law should be interpreted, it effectively sets the standard that lower courts must follow. Judges across the United States often rely on Supreme Court decisions to guide their rulings in cases involving similar legal questions. With this new precedent in place, courts reviewing related disputes will likely reference the reasoning used by the Supreme Court of the United States to determine whether certain policies or regulations meet the same legal standard. This can have immediate consequences for ongoing litigation. Cases that are currently moving through federal district courts or appellate courts may be influenced or even decided based on the new precedent. In some situations, legal challenges that were previously unsuccessful could gain new momentum if the Supreme Court's reasoning supports those arguments. Lawyers and advocacy groups often look closely at decisions like this to determine whether they open the door for new lawsuits or appeals. The ruling may also affect policymakers and government agencies. When the Supreme Court identifies legal limits or clarifies how a statute should be interpreted, agencies often need to reassess their existing rules to ensure they comply with the court's interpretation. This process can lead to revisions, policy changes, or even the withdrawal of certain regulations that no longer fit within the legal framework established by the court. For states, lawmakers, and regulators, the nationwide impact of a Supreme Court ruling means they must carefully evaluate how the decision could affect current laws or enforcement practices. In many cases, the ripple effects of a major decision from the Supreme Court of the United States can shape legal debates and policy decisions for years to come. One of the questions many legal observers immediately asked after the decision was why all 9 justices ultimately reached the same conclusion. In a court that often delivers closely divided rulings, a unanimous outcome suggests that the legal reasoning behind the decision was particularly strong, or that the issue itself presented a clear conflict with established legal principles. When the Supreme Court of the United States reviews a case, the justices carefully examine the text of the law, the intent behind it, and how it has been applied by lower courts. If the court determines that a rule or interpretation clearly contradicts those elements, agreement among the justices becomes more likely. Another factor that often leads to unanimity is the court's shared interest in maintaining the constitutional balance between different branches of government. The American system is built on the idea that Congress creates the laws, the executive branch enforces them, and the judiciary interprets them. When a case raises concerns that a government agency may have expanded its authority beyond what lawmakers authorized, the court may step in to reinforce that separation of powers. In situations where the boundaries appear to have been crossed, justices with different judicial philosophies may still find common ground because they all recognize the importance of preserving the constitutional structure. Legal scholars also note that unanimous rulings can occur when the court sees a need to provide a clear and unified message to lower courts. A divided opinion can sometimes leave room for debate or uncertainty about how the decision should be applied. By issuing a single, unified ruling, the Supreme Court of the United States ensures that judges across the country understand exactly how the law should be interpreted moving forward. This clarity helps prevent inconsistent decisions in different jurisdictions. In addition, the justices may agree on the final outcome even if their reasoning differs slightly. Sometimes the court releases concurring opinions that explain how individual justices reach the same result through different legal approaches. Even so, the final vote still reflects a shared conclusion that the law required the same outcome in this particular case. Following the decision, attention quickly shifted to what the ruling might mean beyond the immediate case. Legal analysts, advocacy groups, and policy experts began discussing whether the reasoning used by the Supreme Court of the United States could be applied to other laws, regulations, or government policies facing similar legal questions. When the Supreme Court clarifies how a statute should be interpreted or outlines limits on government authority, that reasoning often becomes the foundation for future legal challenges. Because of this, major rulings frequently trigger broader debates about how far the decision should extend. Supporters of expanding the impact of the ruling argue that the court's interpretation establishes a clear principle that should apply in other situations where government agencies have taken similar approaches. If the court determined that a particular regulatory action exceeded the authority granted by Congress, advocates may point to that reasoning when challenging other rules they believe stretch the law in comparable ways. In this sense, the decision could serve as a legal roadmap for future cases that raise related questions about statutory interpretation or administrative power. This process often begins with legal scholars and policy organizations analyzing the language of the court's opinion. They closely study how the justices framed their arguments and which legal standards were emphasized. From there, attorneys may begin identifying existing regulations or pending cases that might be influenced by the precedent established by the Supreme Court of the United States. In some situations, groups may file new lawsuits that rely heavily on the court's reasoning, hoping to achieve similar outcomes in other areas of law. At the same time, government agencies and lawmakers are also likely to examine the decision carefully. Agencies may review their current policies to determine whether adjustments are necessary to remain consistent with the court's interpretation. Legislators, meanwhile, could consider whether existing statutes need to be clarified or updated in response to the ruling. As a result, what began as a single case before the Supreme Court of the United States may gradually influence a much wider range of legal and policy discussions across the country. After a major ruling from the Supreme Court of the United States, the legal and policy landscape often begins to shift almost immediately. The first step typically involves lower courts across the country reviewing the Supreme Court's opinion and applying its reasoning to cases that are currently in progress. Judges in federal district courts and appellate courts must follow the precedent set by the nation's highest court, meaning that similar legal disputes may now be decided differently based on the new interpretation of the law. In some situations, cases that were previously paused or awaiting clarification from the Supreme Court may begin moving forward again under the updated legal framework. At the same time, government agencies affected by the ruling will likely begin reviewing their policies and regulations to determine whether changes are required. If the court concluded that a particular rule exceeded the authority granted by Congress, agencies may need to revise their regulatory approach to ensure that future actions stay within the boundaries outlined in the decision. This can involve rewriting regulations, issuing new guidance, or even withdrawing certain rules entirely if they conflict with the legal standard established by the Supreme Court of the United States. Lawmakers may also become involved in the aftermath of the ruling. When the Supreme Court clarifies or limits how a statute can be interpreted, Congress has the power to respond by updating or rewriting the law. If legislators believe that the court's interpretation leaves gaps in policy or prevents agencies from addressing certain issues, they may introduce new legislation designed to restore or expand that authority. Whether such efforts succeed often depends on the political climate and the level of agreement among lawmakers. Meanwhile, attorneys and advocacy organizations will carefully study the court's reasoning to determine how it might influence future legal challenges. New lawsuits may be filed that rely on the precedent established in this decision, potentially extending its impact into other areas of law. As a result, the full consequences of the ruling from the Supreme Court of the United States may continue to unfold through additional court cases, regulatory changes, and legislative responses over the coming months and years. A 9-0 Supreme Court decision is always significant, but when it carries nationwide implications, it becomes even more important to watch. The ruling from the Supreme Court of the United States is already sparking debate, legal analysis, and calls for broader action. And as new challenges emerge, the full impact of this decision may only just be beginning.